Hi, my name is Jeppe Garborg and I am the co-director of EarthWays, an NGO that works to further nature-based and regenerative learning. EarthWays is hosting a series of conversations about how we bring our ways of life into accordance and harmony with the fundamental conditions for life on Earth. We call this series of conversations EarthTalks, and we have invited a range of people from different fields to share their perspective on the global changes that are unfolding and how we move forward on a path that regenerates nature within and without. In this very first conversation of the series, I'm delighted to speak with Steven Jenkinson, the author and culture activist who is working to further grief literacy and elderhood, working from the Orphan Wisdom School, a teaching house for learning skills of deep living and making human culture in Ontario, Canada. Steven has written a number of books about dying and elderhood in ailing cultures and troubled times. He is a voice of sanity and soul and has a way with words like few others. In this conversation, we delve into the cultural roots of the mess we're in, and we talk about the way that grief can help us move differently towards the future. We also talk about Steven's current tour with the Nights of Grief and Mystery show, a concert of sorts, which combines Steven's stories and poetry with original sonics and songs by recording artist Gregory Hoskins. Steven and Gregory are taking their tour to Scandinavia in the coming weeks, and it's possible to experience the show in a variety of places. The connection wasn't always crisp and clear, but I hope you enjoy our conversation and the wisdom that flows from Steven Jenkinson. Thank you for tuning in.
You're on tour at the moment with the collaboration between you and Gregory Hoskins. You called it Nights of Grief and Mystery. We're so lucky to be having you come to our corner of the world here in Scandinavia very soon. August 14th, you'll be in Malmö at the live Konserthus. And following that by a couple of other gigs in Sweden, and if I remember right, you'll be in Oslo on the 19th of August. And so we'll talk a little bit more about these Nights of Grief and Mystery, but maybe would you start out in your own words, just describing, how would you describe your work, your line of work perhaps, and what you do?
With respect to the Grief and Mystery show, you mean?
Yeah, please. You can start out with that,
Sure.
And then delve deeper into the all the other things you're doing with Orphan Wisdom.
Yeah, sure. Well, it wasn't from dissatisfaction with what I was doing up until then. It became, I somehow grew another arm. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. So it's not, it doesn't feel the most easy to manage thing given everything else I was doing. But man, so many more things are possible now with touring with a musical show that's not a musical, that's poetically driven, but it's not, I suppose it's poetry in a way. It's a kind of mythic understanding. It's troublemaking, and it's medicine, and it's alchemy. And I think if this is not too strong, it's a little bit dangerous. Certainly dangerous to the status quo, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow that's all of the death trade work I did, all of the having a school, farming, which I was just doing this morning before I got on the call here with the sheep, as any good Viking would do, taking care of the sheep first. And I was very lucky to be approached by a musician who thought we would make some interesting event with no rehearsal. So that's exactly what we did. We talked about it for half an hour, and before you know it, we're in New York City in front of a sold-out audience, figuring things out as we went. And the people loved it at the end. And I remember making eye contact with Gregory at the time maybe 15 minutes in, and we both said the same thing at the same time. There's really something here. And this is not to be ignored or taken for granted. And that was 8 years ago. And 3 records later, we have a 4th record basically that's finished. And we've toured all over, big parts of the world, I guess. Hundreds and hundreds of shows by now. And it is, along with my school, the best thing I've ever done. And I'm extremely proud of how challenging and how affirming this event is.
Yes, sure. I'm looking forward to coming to Malmö. So Gregory approached you, I guess, on the basis of knowing your work as an author, or maybe through Grief Walker. Would you tell us a little bit more about that whole part of your work?
Sure. Well, I didn't know that there's such a thing existed as a specific practice area called taking care of dying people. I just thought it was part of the healthcare system in a general sort of way, and I learned otherwise. And somehow I was talked into joining. I'm not really an organizational guy, so I don't do well in that context. And I mean, it's proven true my whole life. But for a while, I was able to manage the kind of administrative and political environment that any organization requires you to understand. And while I was there, I discovered almost instantly that I knew what I was doing with no prior experience. I don't recommend that as a strategy for anybody else. And I wasn't aware of it until I was there. But intuitively, the work was very available to me, and almost right away. And at the same time, I began to learn how drastically misconceived most of the work that was being done was. It was basically an attempt to control the realities of dying to the point where the dying itself became a secondary or tertiary concern. And it was people's comfort that was more important, or people's ease of mind that was most important. And I thought this was the last in a long line of lost opportunities to get it right, to get being a human means right. And the way we die is at least as deep an expression of our humanity or our compromised humanity as anything else we can manage in the course of a lifetime. So I realized I had a responsibility to dying as well as to dying people. And I became, well, they called me the death guy for years. And occasionally I still get called that. And I think that's fair. I'm other things too, but I'm happy to be an advocate for what dying could and should be in the contemporary Western, highly medicalized and now highly specialized environment, whose first casualty is not dying people. It's the realities of dying that disappear first, either through treatment or through cosmetics or through mood-altering medications or whatever it is, antidepressants and so on. People have a very hard time dying if their dying is micromanaged to such an extent that they lose track of it all the time. That's what happened. So I realized, man, there's a work to do here that the institution is not confessing or even aware of. That's how I started. I kind of invented my own job. Mm-hmm. And the book, Die Wise, is basically an articulation of that invention.
Sure. And so I'm guessing I don't know when Orphan Wisdom, when it started, but so I started my doctoral research in 2010-11. So if I remember right, I think it was around the time that someone directed me towards your work, and all of what you were saying around dying and basically how we manage dying as a way of not confronting reality was something that I, in my line of research, I'm working in environmental science. Yeah. I felt a connection in the way that looking at what's going on with the planet, what's going on with the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, extinction, the multiple crises that we're in. There was a parallel because the way that we talked about it back then, and it's a while back now, so I think times have changed. This was before Greta Thunberg, and but back then, and this is still the case, and for a lot of people, I think that the environmental crisis was out there. It was a crisis in the world, in nature, which conceived as something out there separate from culture. And if we're living through all of these consequences of the past, it's basically climate change is a consequence of a way that we've been in the world and a way that we've seen the world and acted from which where we are constantly putting up filters or barriers or avoiding not to look at reality. And what you were saying about dying, I felt like there was a direct parallel to a sort of problem of our culture. I don't know if that was not actually, I didn't actually articulate a question there, but I wonder whether could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I recognize very much what you're describing here. And I recognize the parallels too. And it's not surprising because in both cases, what we're talking about is what you could call an inadvertent ending, an ending that's not part of the plan. Mm-hmm. That's not doesn't seem to be a consequence of what we intended to do, how we intended to live, and so forth. The notion that somehow everybody knows about dying, but nobody's way of life reflects that knowledge. And it's a kind of functioning schizophrenia, whether you're talking about personal death or now whether we're talking about, I've heard the phrase climate anxiety, perhaps to describe the current iteration of this visitation, no?
Yeah.
So all of these things appeal to the same repertoire of coping strategy. But coping is the least achieved way of coming to crises, in my estimation. We have a responsibility to understand that the current regime, geopolitical and economic and ecological and existential, the current regime is what we meant, not what we intended. I'm talking about what we're looking at is the full-blown meaning of the way we, particularly in the West, insisted upon living or couldn't find an alternative to, but it's definitely what we meant. And I find very few people are able to entertain that understanding because they personally would have chosen otherwise, they imagine. But the truth of the matter is that nowhere near enough of us chose otherwise. And so we are exactly where we are as a consequence of as much of what we didn't do as what we did do, mm-hmm. or what we didn't choose as well as what we chose. If you put that together and you take it from the ecological framework and put it into the mortality framework, item by item, it becomes the same declaration and the same lament, I should say. So that's principally my stock in trade, I think, is mm-hmm. to craft a more and more articulate and recognizable lament. Because without the lament, I don't think there's recognition. Because we remain addicted to what W.H. Auden called a regime where we'd rather be defeated than be persuaded. Mm-hmm. And we may be at a point now where our being persuaded just doesn't matter anymore, because the defeats are more present than they are future.
Yes. Yeah. Well, one of the things that, you know, I was supposedly researching something called grassroots innovations. And I got very interested in not so much the innovation, but the story about the innovation, or the story of what it is, why people are doing what they're doing. And in that connection, I researched with a network in the UK called the Dark Mountain Project. I know
Yes.
that there are parallels to your work with what both Paul Kingsnorth and Dougal Hine are doing, and I know some of the people around that project, like Martin Shaw, is also a friend of yours. And what became clear to me researching the stories, and you know, in the academic world, they'd like it to be stories, you know, the how of stories becomes how to produce change. How do we make how do we get people to come together and do things and scale it up? But what became clear from, you know, the conversations around the Dark Mountain Project was that you know, that's just skimming the surface, because underneath there is a whole the whole worldview, or the mythology or the cosmology of the modern world doesn't really allow us to sink down under the surface, but we keep looking for ways to solve problems. So we always, you know, climate change is a problem, environmental disaster is a problem, but and one way of framing this, which I've also find useful, is, you know, how, you know, the condition we're in is, it's not really helpful to keep approaching it as a problem, when in reality it's a predicament. It's not something we're going to solve. It's something we have to live through, and that calls for a different approach to being alive today, perhaps. And this sort of brings me to another question I would like to pose to you, because your Orphan Wisdom and your teaching house, you know, you have this ambition, and I'd like to hear more about this, but you know, you are teaching the skills of deep living, and making human culture. And so I'd like to ask you, what are those skills?
Grief, principally.
Mm-hmm.
Recognition, secondly. The capacity to purposefully submit is another one. To cultivate the ability to have a disciplined inquiry about things, as opposed to reactivity about things. To make a primordial distinction between debt and obligation. Mm-hmm. And I guess underneath all of these things, and your observations a few minutes ago refreshed my memory about this. We are basically heirs to the Iron Age. And the Iron Age, the onset of the Iron Age, which took place in different places and different times, I should say, at different places, had a remarkable sameness to its consequence everywhere it erupted, everywhere it was inflicted. And the wholesale dislocation of the Iron Age populace everywhere it took place is remarkably underreported and underresponded to these many thousand years later. But we're still in the grip of being in a place we don't belong to. So the place belongs to us instead, which is no kind of belonging for humans. Mm-hmm. Like the surrogacy of ownership is not the same thing as belonging somewhere, especially at the level of purpose, especially at the level of what is the project of being alive. Yeah. And surely to God, it's not problem solving. especially given the source of the problems are the things we've continued to fail to address. So grief is a kind of recognition of these chronic failures. And it seems to me that any program, and I don't have a program for fixing any of this, I should say, and I don't feel the obligation to have one. But I would say that the mania for fixes is another grief bypass in a long line of grief bypasses. If you can't be arrested, I mean, genuinely brought to stillness, not once, but as a kind of spiritual practice, by the recognition of exactly the fundamental poverties that persist now, then every solution you generate will carry these poverties forward. Will plant a new generation of these poverties, yeah? So that's the Orphan Wisdom School project in a nutshell, is to slow down the notion of innovation for its own sake, to fundamentally question the notion of growth, either inner or outer, personal or otherwise, and vote for a kind of involuntary stillness, a coming to a stop before we're stopped. Yeah, it's a moral obligation, as I understand it, not a lifestyle choice. And so I have a sense of urgency about these things that my choice of language tends to reflect. Yeah, and I did have some dealings and some interviews with the Dark Mountain folks at various times, and I spoke with Dougal Hine just very recently in a call session that we did, and I'm aware that there's a lot of talk about as if something's ending, as if some fundamental, structures of Western lifeways are ending. Pardon me. I'm not persuaded that this is true. So I'd like to offer this as a realization that I bring from the death trade to what we're talking about now. And it's this. In the English language, the verb to die is by definition an active verb. You can't use the verb accurately in English in the passive voice. What that means grammatically is what it means existentially too, ontologically. It means this: dying is not something that happens to you. Dying is something you do. And if that's what it is, then it's possible not to do it. It's possible to refuse to do it, to opt out of doing it. Excuse me. And so I submit to you that the undertaking of dying, the undertaking of the project of seeing something to its conclusion, or as I like to say it more informally, to see something down. This takes an enormous amount of bravery and courage and discipline to do. Not to try to rescue something that has been rescued far too many times. The kind of the generic, acquisitive and consumptive life ways of the West. They've been rescued too many times. They've been on life support for so long. It's the artifice of our way of life is staggeringly impoverished. And so I think it's premature and a bit irresponsible to talk about it as if it's dying on its own. We have a responsibility to get it to die, to oblige it to die. And this is exactly what I did in the death trade. I obliged dying people to undertake the work of dying and not wait as if dying is a collection of symptoms, which eventually you will succumb to. It's the same. So when they talk about hospicing, the modernity and things like this, I find the language unnecessarily passive and not really the understanding that we have to participate actively in the quieting and the cessation of these ways of life tends to get lost in when the language is used as if you're describing something that's going to happen no matter what we do.
Mm-hmm. That makes an awful lot of sense to me. I think that the whether it's at the political level or within. So I've been following the whole. Basically, that was my doctoral research was centered around sustainability, and I haven't yet found. I haven't yet found really anywhere where sustainability doesn't end up meaning sustaining the status quo, and all of the talk of the future that comes from that seems to be, well, either it's like we're on Titanic headed for a collision, or we're already off the cliff, or it's like collapse is coming. And what you're saying now is that this may be so, but if we don't actively participate, if we don't actively I don't know what the right word is, perhaps steward the cessation of the growth economy and of the mindset that comes along with that, then we might actually be headed somewhere a lot worse off than what could be coming out of this sort of this collective death, or what is dying between us.
Yeah.
Is it? And so I wonder, because one of the things that we've been having a conversation about, or we are having a conversation about here at our little organization in EarthWays, is how do we find a language, or begin to find ways or approach exactly this difference, because we would like to, we're calling it a regenerative learning, as a way of saying, there is this, I don't know if you're familiar with regeneration as a sort of new term that's come up. The way I understand it is basically that sustainability is basically about minimizing our impact, or in the best of worlds, not leaving an impact, limiting ourselves, which we surely need to do. But regeneration is a way of saying that that's not actually enough, or that's perhaps we should talk about leaving a positive impact, or a positive footprint, or finding a way into a conversation about relationship, and about how do we as human beings rediscover, or there's a lot of words here, but
exactly what I was going to point out.
Yeah, and one of the sort of aspects of this, now that you picked up on that, is there's also a lot of talk about finding a new story, or new myths, or new something, and I recognize the intention in that drive, in that conversation, but perhaps it's not new stories. Maybe the story seems new, but maybe it's actually the myths are old, or so I guess what I'm trying to get at is how do you experience this? How do you find the way through into this conversation? How do we actually avoid bringing all of the old mindset into into this.
You don't. You don't. What you do instead
Mhm.
is recognize when the unexamined or the customary makes its way back in. And all of the words that you employed that have RE at the beginning
Mhm.
are all ways that the old order reestablishes itself in your solutions.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Restore, renew. Okay. So I'm going to give you another one and I'm going to see if I can undo it.
Yeah.
Like in real time.
Mhm.
So you're no doubt aware that my country here, Canada, has a reprehensible record when it comes to, among other things, what's called the residential school system here. You familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So, and this is has become current again. It's rediscovered. There's another one of those words. Okay. So one of the restorative, there's another word, strategy that's been floated forwards is something they call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that traveled the country that tried to establish, well, I'm not going to say what it tried to do. I'll just leave it at it was out and about and it remains. And it's become a catchphrase. Truth and reconciliation is like a kind of t-shirt slogan now. And I don't mean to diminish what it's trying to deal with. But I do mean to diminish the slogan aspect of the thing, and here's why. It's not the word truth so much that troubles me, although that's troubling enough, but it's the reconciliation one. Here's why. The presumption of the word is that once upon a time there was conciliation, and something happened, or a lot of things happened, or stopped happening, and as a consequence of that, we're in need of a new conciliation, a reconciliation. What I'm going to tell you is when people who look like me came to this continent, there was no conciliation that ever took place. The word conciliation signals something like this. There was a time when relative equals recognized each other. I'm not saying it was all pleasant, but I'm saying the fundament of the encounter was a recognition of relative equality, a mutual status recognition. And it was there from the beginning. That's what conciliation means. It means other things too, but it definitely requires that mutually acknowledged, mutually recognized aspect. That never took place. The Europeans never did that. Not then, not now. So the word reconciliation is hopelessly premature. It's wrong-headed in its prematurity because we haven't done the conciliating part first. So there's nothing to restore. We've never been there. I think this goes a long way towards contending with what you were describing earlier.
Yeah.
That there needs to be some recognition, not of backing off, not of lifting up again something that was won in some kind of beautiful supremacy. And it's for some reason, modernity has let it slip a bit or a lot. And as a result, we have to clean up things. So what we're talking about is a degree of regard for the made world that was in eclipse so long ago that functionally speaking, there is no living human at least in the Western world that ever occupied a place where the world was held in high esteem in the day in and day out work of being a Western person. Yes. I don't think that's ever been there. That's why I happen to mention the Iron Age just in passing. The Iron Age was a complete war against the made world, one blade at a time. So we have to craft a language, and it's in a way similar to what I had to do in the death trade. When I was there, the malpractice around the language would be hard for me to overstate to you. It was that bad. The language that was employed continually used euphemisms and alleged synonyms to replace the verb to die. You weren't allowed to use it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there wasn't a edict to that effect, but the practice was very clear.
Mm-hmm.
The practice made sure that the realities of dying were the first casualty of talking about dying. Why? Because that was what compassion looked like. Compassion, you know, the best way I can say it is this. A guy challenged me one time at a teaching session, and he was quite aggressive. And his challenge went like this. He said, "What gives you the right to be so direct with people who are dying?"
Mm-hmm.
Now you can hear the emphasis of the challenge. Apparently, directness or candor or clarity or lucidity, these things are by definition not compassionate in the context we're talking about. And so there, you employing them has to be defended. Now, I could have gone at it that way, but I didn't. My response to him was this: what gives you the right to be so indirect with people who are dying? And nobody in the room had thought that thought.
Yeah.
You see, indirectness by definition was compassionate. And I'm suggesting to you, quite the contrary, it was malpractice of the linguistic kind. You see? So then I'm saying to you that language is the place where you foment the revolution first.
Yeah.
It's in the language that you employ that you be more and more alert to the unintended consequences of half speak and half representation and half manifestation and those kinds of things. Understanding that candor, especially in a time like this, is exactly what compassion requires.
Right. Well, I relate to this directly in my practice as a teacher. For the last 7.5 years, I've been teaching at a folk high school here in Denmark. Folk high schools have a particular history. I think is enough to say that there are in places of informal education where there are no exams and no curriculum, basically. So as long as you can attract enough students to come to your corner, then you have a subject. And so I've been running a course which is about I say words like global ecology and so on. We basically look at how it is going with the ice and the oceans and the forests and the cultural diversity, the ethnosphere. All of these is sort of like a virtual journey through these spheres of our world, and they find it incredibly hard, difficult, and I've had to sort of establish a second track, which is about sort of the alternatives to consumer society. So we, grow oyster mushrooms on the school coffee grounds, and make soap and do things that bring some sort of vitality to the room, whereas all of the more painful stuff, it's painful to look at, what's going on with the biosphere, and I find myself in exactly this situation where I'm always as direct as I feel I can be, but I also feel culturally this other side, which is more indirect and sort of dancing around the whole thing to help them sort of be in this difficult situation. And I think the times that it's gone really well is when we've established a shared space where we can just be direct and be as you say, straight on, candid, honest, and I meet my former students, sort of a lot of them I meet regularly, and it's always this part of the course, although it was the most difficult emotionally, then it's the thing that did something for them, the thing that they remember. But there are
Right.
so many, and I feel this even after 7.5 years. I feel this, my own sort of upbringing and cultural baggage is so heavy, you know. I feel like that guy sometimes in the room asking you that question, you know, directness, you know, like how can we do this to each other? But yeah, as you
Yeah.
said, I think
What you're talking about is a kind of emotional lucidity, which I would call eloquence. When it manifests in the mouth, that's what it is. But there's an eloquence in the ear as well. And I think in a circumstance like you're describing, I have a school myself. This is the fundamental responsibility of the person at the front of the room, is to lead by example and to craft the understanding that eloquence should not be reserved for the things you feel good about.
Mhm.
That's usually where it gets spent, right? We become more and more eloquent the more certain we are, and
Yeah.
the more favorable we find things. Our eloquence tends to go there.
Sure.
But I'm suggesting to you, in a time like the one we're in now, real eloquence, functioning eloquence, socially engaged eloquence is the kind of eloquence that you reserve for your consternation, for your heartbreak, not for your affirmations.
Mhm.
If you can't be eloquent there, then you're being extremely selective about where your emotional lucidity belongs. And I think it belongs in tragedy, to be honest. Because we live in a tragic time, which doesn't always mean sad. Tragic means there are certain things that are no longer likely. How do you occupy the less likely scenarios? That even though your mind can generate an optimal solution, you know, veneer, but you know in your bones the likelihood of these things coming to pass in your lifetime or at all, they're remote now. They've become remote. Okay, so until there's an eloquence about that doesn't turn into one word depression, you know, single cell depression.
Mhm.
Until that happens, we're forever troubled by not feeling great. But this is not a time for not feeling great. Look, of course, we understand that in the midst of the crisis, there is capacity for genuine joy. Of course, there is. And genuine, you know, happiness about being alive and its way of being articulated and so on. These things all belong. They're not distractions. But the love of being alive in a time like ours means nothing at all if it doesn't find its connection with the sorrow.
Mhm.
Right? So my way of saying this over the years in the death trade was, until you see the end of what you hold dear, you're not really holding it dear. What you're doing is you're loving the upside, the good part, the favorable part, the part that has promise. It's an understandable thing, but really it's a beginner's mistake. And grown-ups understand that you have to be able to love the whole thing, not just the part that you like. It's the same with, you know, engaging a person in romance. If you don't find a way to say yes to the whole thing, you'll be constantly dividing what you like in the person from what you don't like.
Mhm.
And it's clearly a bad habit, and it doesn't work for anybody.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with what you were describing earlier, that we have an obligation to employ our eloquence where our heart is broken. And to do that in front of people half your age is a fundamental responsibility of being an older person.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that connects to a question I have around you know, how you approach, but I think you kind of already said it, but because I've been working with young people, and because they have a real need for eloquence around this issue, which has been couched in abstract terms and been, they're sort of in need of a way to be with this, an approach, and I guess my question is, where do we look as teachers? Where, I mean, you've written and talked about elderhood and the loss of elderhood. I mean, if I think in terms of my own life, I've pretty much, since I was a child and throughout my time in academia and as a teacher, I've been thinking, where is my mentor? Where is my guide? And I've been able to then pick up a book here and there and sort of scramble together something that I feel like I can hang on to. But how do we, who have not grown up with actual elders or with mentors or with guides, how do we how do we help young people? And I'm not just talking about people in their 20s. I mean, I also have small children, and they're not quite old enough yet to really sort of need my guidance in life, but at the moment it's much smaller. But how do we approach this task?
At the risk of sounding repetitive, one of the things you do is be very alert to whether or not you're choosing adequate synonyms for elderhood or for being an elder. You used mentor and guide just a second ago, okay? So I'm going to disqualify those by saying to you, that's not what an elder is. So to greater and greater clarity about what an elder isn't is extremely helpful, I think. So here's the big one. Elderhood is very often confused in modernity with being supportive. Now, there's an enormous problem with being supportive as a generic approach to younger people. And the problem is everything you propose to support worthy of being supported? Is that what you're saying? That the person as they are, with their understanding as it is, and the life that they're living as it is, all of that requires support, does it? Is that what we're willing to say? That because it's such a hard time and the kids are in harm's way, by definition, they need to be supported? Because I'm going to suggest to you that kind of singular vision of what support is a kind of functional lie. Okay? Yes, it's a hard time, but the sane response, the responsible response, is not to say, it's hard enough, just leave them alone, don't ask anything of them. Quite the contrary. A time like this, you may have seen this I think it's in Come of Age, but I can't remember now. The gist of it goes to this. Like me, you were born into a troubled time. The kids that we're talking about now were born into a troubled time. This is not negotiable. This is clearly true. But what does it mean to have been born into a troubled time? What do you take its meaning to be? Well, here's two choices. You can decide it's an affliction, something that you didn't deserve, that it should have been a better deal, and it's not, and there's somebody to blame, and it's not you. And if you find out who the bad guys are, you're better off, etc. That whole regime. You could decide, on the other hand, that being born into a troubled time constitutes an assignment, not an affliction. I'm not saying it's pleasant, but I'm saying there's a clarity that comes with trouble or can come. And the clarity about what's being asked of you by the troubles of the times might not be a welcome clarity, but that's what an elder does. An elder renegotiates the relationship between mercy and clarity.
Mhm.
Yeah, in a way that life guides and life coaches and business coaches and that ilk tends not to do, for obvious reasons, because it's very hard to get a kid to come back to talk to you twice if you don't generically support their take on things.
Mm.
And so an elder's job is not to get the kids to come back and come back and come back no matter what. An elder's job is to risk it all one time and to reimagine that support is not always called for.
Mm.
That something closer to alliance is what's called for. And you can't ally with somebody that you're arbitrarily supporting in principle. I don't think that's alliance then. I think that's collusion of some kind, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Mhm.
So you have to be, in a sense, as an elder, you have to be the voice box of the world. You have to speak on behalf, not just of a better time, of a better day. You have to be the voice of the world as it stands now, as it suffers now, as it swoons and wanes now. So if a young person, 1/2 or 1/3 your age, is trying to hear the voice of the world, they can hear it in an authentic elder. They may not like what they hear, but that's not the point. The point is they get to have an engagement with what the world would have us understand. And well-engaged elders are principally spokespeople of their times, not defenders, spokespeople.
Mhm.
They're literally giving voice to the deeply unpopular dilemmas of the times. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steven,
Sure.
for your words.
I should have said, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the other half of this, from the elder's point of view,
Mhm.
is the elder has to be willing to be deeply misunderstood to the point where the likelihood of the elder being alone for the duration of their agedness is very possible.
Mhm. Yeah.
Why? Because they're not in advertising, because they're not in therapy, because they're not in life coaching,
Mhm.
because they're not trying to make everything okay. They're not surrogate parents. They're like godparents.
Mhm.
And if you think what the word godparent actually means, man, that's unnerving to think of a job that has God in the title.
Mhm.
But surely it is the responsibility of a God not to lie to you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. I think you've given my last question was around, you know, what to expect from a night of grief and mystery. I think you gave me a very clear sense of what to expect here. Just to round off, do you want to? I mean, you're going to be in Malmö on the 14th of August, and if people are not able to be there on that particular date, there are a couple of more dates in Sweden and one in Oslo as well. What would you want to just say a little bit about what to expect from a night of grief and mystery, where if I understand it right, you'll be I mean, it's you and Gregory, you're a duo on
Yeah.
these nights. Is that right?
Yes. We're collaborating and we're improvising. We're ceremonializing, not really performing. It's not really theater, because what we're trying to do in the Nights of Grief and Mystery is to compromise two elements that make theater theatrical. And one of them is the audience, is the idea of an audience. and the other one is the idea of a script. And I think what an audience does, excuse me, what an audience tends to do is engage in the Caesar function, right? Principally, like that. And an audience doesn't participate actively in the outcome of the event. In actual fact, if you're engaging in making a ceremony, then everyone's participation is crucial to the outcome, not just the people at the front, everyone. So the responsibility is generously distributed. Yeah. And when it comes to the idea of script kind of forecloses on the outcome. Kind of, it's pre-established. And especially what the script tends to do is eliminate the presence of the other world, the gods, if you will, the ancestors, and so forth. It makes them obsolete because it establishes that this is what's going to happen no matter who comes, who doesn't come. So right out of the gate, the first thing I do is make an explicit invitation to the unseen world to attend to what we're doing, because we could use the help, and we've been alone long enough, and maybe they have too. Welcome, friends, I say, for friends we may soon be. Friends are forged on the dark road that's heading out of town, and we're headed there. So how shall we be then, and what shall we say now that the call and the summons and the plea has gone out? It's better that we make as though many a thing hangs in the rafters above us, or hangs in the balance below, as if how we are with each other, that's how the lords of chance will be with us, as if what we say this very evening will bring in the saints and the ancients of days, or bring down the darkness and the rough gods. That's how I begin. That's a prayer. See, so that's what I mean about ceremonializing. I think that's what we're doing. I think it's an accurate word. It's not to say that this is a religious endeavor. This is something that's older than religion. It's so old that modern people can't recognize it. And I had a very difficult time understanding what we were doing for 3 or 4 or 5 years, because I was discovering it in the act of doing it, you see. But now, 8 years into the enterprise, I think I recognize what we're doing. And the amazing response across the world tends to be stillness. Yes, occasionally wild, rambunctious response, particularly in places like Ireland and Italy, places like that. But in actual fact, most of what happens is people are leaning forward in their seats to not miss anything, without understanding for the moment exactly what this is. But it turns out they don't have to. It turns out there's something else available that has nothing to do with, quote, understanding every word. It's a kind of powerful recognition, and it's a great alliance that we can establish when it works. And when it works, and it's magic.
Well, it's a very powerful experience to listen to you speak, Steven. Your eloquence goes right to heart. So thank you for showing up for this conversation. I very much look forward to seeing you in Malmö before too long. Are you
Amen.
Are you at home now until you come to Scandinavia, or you have other stuff?
No. Oh yes, yeah. We're touring and starting in Texas, in the United States, in about 10, 12 days from now, I think, something like that, for 2 weeks, and then the Eastern United States and parts of Canada for 2 or 3 weeks. And somewhere either in between, we end up in Scandinavia. I honestly don't have it all memorized, because there's too many details and too many dates to remember. But if people want to find it all in one place, It's on the orphanwisdom.com website. That's where the whole schedule is. And that's how they can buy tickets, and that whole thing is there.
Sure. I'll put up a link to your
We're very
website.
keen to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for now, Steven. I look forward to next time.
Yes, indeed. Thank you too.
Thank you.
And so, there'll be saints this evening, or there'll be darkness this evening, and we'll be persons of consequence this evening, or we'll be persons of interest this evening. And sure, we'll be human for a while. But that's the deal. Just a while. And then mystery comes, and mystery just takes the rest. So we are unsteady pilgrims now. And we're playing for time. For we are modern. God knows we are. And we are homeless. And we are confused by freedom.